I'm in your hands.
So welcome to this Aephoria podcast with me, Lucille Greeff. And today I'm joined by Jeremy Opperman. And Jeremy is one of our Aephoria Partners Associates and someone who works in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jeremy also has his own organization called Disability Desk. Jeremy, it's lovely to have you here today. Thank you so much for showing up to speak about some of the challenges that people experience that live with disabilities, and particularly the ins and outs of disclosure and disability disclosure in the workplace. Very, very good to have you here.
Thank you, Lucille. It's good to see you again. And it's great to join you on this and discuss this issue.
So Jeremy, before we jump into the content, why don't you just share a little bit of your own background with the people that are listening here? Why are these issues important to you?
So I've been a diversity practitioner now for 22 years. I started Disability Desk in 99. I had a career in marketing of HR services, and then the Employment Equity Act came out in 98. And I started marketing consultants around that, and disability came up as an issue. I happen to be blind, which is more coincidental than causal in terms of my interest in this area. And so, of course, I had a sort of empathic connection with the topic. And I started paying a lot of attention. So in a sense, I'm an analyst, if you like, having watched the progression and trajectory of the Employment Equity Act in the country. It related particularly to disability. I mean, I am a diversity practitioner, and I'm quite comfortable to broaden the scope. But the fact is that disability is, in fact, very often the poorer cousin of the family of DEI. So I guess my blindness and 20 odd years of watching this trajectory has really fueled why I'm still doing this.
Yeah, and you've done some amazing things, also influencing part of how provincial government looks at disability and disability inclusion as well along the years.
It's true. So I was a consultant for 17 years, and then I was asked to create a disability desk in the province, the Western Cape province. And that'd never been done before, and that was very interesting. That was 5 years. And so, you know, I'm now back in consulting mode. But yes, it's been a really interesting journey. I've seen an awful lot. I've done a lot of research in persons with disabilities as well as management. We used to run a survey of both management of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities themselves in the workplace. And it was very interesting. It wasn't a paper survey, it was an interview survey. And it generated extraordinary data. Which showed a very clear pattern, a very clear, very scary pattern actually, about how disability equity is unfolding and working or not. And sadly, it's not always working, and it certainly hasn't generated the kind of inclusion that we would have liked to see. So it's been quite a scary, quite a sad journey in many ways. But it's also been good to watch how some corporates have tried to embrace it wholeheartedly. But yeah, that's really what I wanted to say. That it's been a good journey, but an interesting one.
Yeah. So of course, if we want to promote further inclusion of people living with disabilities in the workplace, it definitely starts with disclosure. I think there are many other steps along the way, and you and I will talk about some of them in further and later podcasts as well. But disclosure is an important building block in the inclusion story for people living with disabilities. For those people who don't understand the kind of intricacies of disclosure, won't you share a little bit about what this is about?
So disclosure is where, now there's a couple of elements to disclosure. So on the one hand, you could have a situation where you want to apply for a job. And now you may have, let's say you have a disability, but you're perfectly competent, you're qualified, you're educated, you're experienced, you want to apply for the job. But you know from experience that mentioning your disability up front might in fact jeopardize you, because from experience, you know that sadly, agencies, for instance, haven't been the greatest allies of disability, ironically, inadvertently sometimes. And so you realize that if I disclose too early, I'm not going to get a chance to show my mettle in an interview. And so you shut up and you say nothing. And so you pitch at an interview. And that's one element of disclosure. The other element of disclosure.
Jeremy, I'm just going to pop that cartoon up that you shared as you speak about that.
That's a great place for the cartoon, actually.
Yeah.
So is it up, Lucille?
Yes, it's up.
All right. So in the cartoon, what you see is sadly a very typical scenario. So there's a gentleman with a physical disability. His CV is on the table. It's clearly it says MBA, just to illustrate that he's clearly competent. And the interviewer himself is thinking one thing and he's saying another. And the thought process in the interviewer's situation there is what you want to focus on, because he's freaking out about the idea of the person with the disability. How's he going to get to work? How's he going to go to the toilet? Is someone going to have to help him? Can he do the work? How's he going to... And he's panicking, really, because he hasn't really engaged with the situation. He has no experience. And so he's working purely from assumption. And what pops out of his mouth is, well, I'm terribly sorry, but the job's been taken. I don't think I have anything for you. I forget what he actually says.
Yes.
Now, you need to trust me when I tell you that this is the status quo. This is very typical. And so this is one of the reasons why people with disabilities are gun shy around disclosing. So there's always been a big debate in provincial and in fact in government circles, where there's a form, I think it's called Z88, and it requires you to disclose your race, your gender, your disability. And many people, including myself, say, actually, I don't think you should, because you can't guarantee that just the simple sight of the word disability won't land your form into the dustbin, because we know that there's a gap. And here's a very interesting thing, is that if you ask your managers and your recruiters in companies, they'll say, how come we never see CVs of persons with disabilities? On the other hand, if you ask your persons with disabilities, they'll say, how come we never get interviewed? We send our CVs continuously.
Yes.
So there's clearly a hole somewhere, which is swallowing up these CVs, and we have a breakdown somewhere. And so that's your first element of disclosure.
And just, Jeremy, if we stand still there, there's an irony to this as well. I mean, in the broader EE context, because employing people with disabilities is actually something that's incredibly beneficial from an EE reporting space. And yet the breakdown already starts around the way in which the recruitment process actually makes it very difficult, and the biases in the recruitment process makes it difficult for people to disclose. So it's a breakdown in great intentions in the legislation that happens even before someone's joined the organization.
But now here's the thing, and here I'm going to say this word many times in our session, is awareness. So the fundamental lack of awareness of most employers around the issue of disability is the key here. And something I've noticed, you heard me say earlier that I'm something of an analyst. One of the things that I can tell you categorically is that the companies who have done more work on increasing their levels of disability awareness. There's a lovely term that they use in Britain. It's called disability confidence. And so companies that are more disability confident, because they have engaged, they have made themselves more aware using workshops like disability awareness workshops, that sort of thing, they have a greater level of disclosure success, because people will disclose more comfortably if they feel that the company isn't going to let them down.
Yeah.
which neatly leads us into the second issue of disclosure, which is two things. People who have acquired a disability while they're already employed, or maybe they were under the radar the whole time and they just simply said nothing.
Yes.
There was big controversy years ago when the Employment Equity Act first came out back in '98. You had people with some sort of physical disabilities. A couple of people I remember were amputees, and they were reluctant, almost aggressively reluctant, to disclose, in the sense of saying, everyone knew that they had a prosthetic, but they
Yes.
said, why on earth must I now tell you that I've got this thing? I don't
Yes.
want you to put me down as an employment equity candidate. I've been doing the job for 20 years. Why should I? So there was that, a resistance. But the principal resistance has been of people being frightened of disclosing, because they are petrified that it will in some way impede their job. They will either lose opportunities for promotion, or they will maybe be boarded. And let me tell you, that's a very, very real thing. It happens. Medical boarding, even in this day, of persons with disabilities, and I believe flagrantly wrong, or is often flagrantly wrong. So it's a genuine fear out there. So the people don't want it. So the moment they feel that the company is improving, and I've seen it, when I run workshops, I've had people disclosing in the workshop in front of their boss on more than one occasion. Been very moving experience, and they did it because they felt safe doing it in front of me, in front of other people. They felt safe doing it because they realized the boss had shifted in his knowledge. And it's wonderful to see. So I've seen a variety of great examples of disclosure, which, and we can probably touch on the issue of disclosure campaigns. There are in fact ways of trying to improve your disclosure in an organization.
Before we go there, I mean, just the whole thing around the risk that people feel that they're taking when they disclose disabilities is in many ways a real risk if there's not sufficient awareness and disability confidence in the organization. When it comes to things like performance ratings, and that's these days linked to bonuses so often. The biases that we bring into that affects, and before we even talk about disability, we know things that, like, often Black women get rated lower in performance evaluations. So imagine for a moment you've got a disclosed disability. And then, of course, the other side of that risk is not disclosing the disability means that reasonable accommodation is not possible because people are not aware of people's needs.
And that's a great, thank you for leading me into that, because that's exactly right. So what the Employment Equity Act says, and I must just tell you that what's very sad about this is that people aren't in fact reading the literature that's around. So in 2002, 2001, a very good code of practice came out, and it's been amended twice now. And it's called the Code of Good Practice on the Employment of Persons with Disabilities, to be read in combination with the Employment Equity Act. And it's crystal clear. You couldn't get a simpler guide if you tried, on tips on what to do and not to do. And then there's a separate document called the TAG, the Technical Assistance Guide, which is also useful. And so it's not like the stuff doesn't exist. But now the reasonable accommodation, so what the code clearly says is that if you don't disclose, you can, and that's how I sell disclosure to people with disabilities. I do, that's one of the jobs that I do, in fact, is I promote disclosure. And so I say to them, you're clearly struggling here. Take an example. I mean, a woman I encountered recently who struggled with vision. Her vision was deteriorating. She's in her 30s. She's clearly got an age-related eye condition, very common. And she was struggling to see the monitor, struggling to see paper. And she was petrified. She was looking closer and closer. She managed to get IT to give her a bigger screen, which gave her some relief for a while. Clearly, it's not going to work forever, but petrified to actually formally disclose, in fact, flatly refused to disclose. And so the company asked me to step in. And I, because I have a visual impairment, which was degenerative, when I first met you, 100 years ago, when you were only a teenager at a course, you recall, my vision was way better than it is now.
Yes.
I mean, I was still legally blind, but it was a hell of a lot better.
Yeah.
So I was able to convince this lady that by disclosing, two things happen. One is you are immediately protected by the Employment Equity Act. Two, the company is immediately obliged to apply the Employment Equity Act in the form of reasonable accommodation. Now, I must tell you that there are companies who have been less than honest and have been very dodgy around the reasonable accommodation, but it's rare enough not to be a pandemic. But it's still scary when it happens, when they flatly refuse. And there's some entertaining legal precedents around the issue, which I can put out there, but we don't need to say that now. But so, yeah, reasonable accommodation. So the people the staff need to realize that if you don't disclose, you can't, in fact, expect reasonable accommodation applied strictly in the law.
And one of the things you and I have spoken about before as well is just the way a lot of organizations rely quite heavily on employee assistance programs to support people with all kinds of challenges, including people with disabilities. How have you seen the EAP programs respond to issues of disclosure and a sensitivity in general? Very,
very interesting question. And it's quite a convoluted answer, because watching it in the early days, there was a lot more internal EAP. So you had a department and you had a nurse possibly, or an OT, or even a social worker, a psychologist. And they did work internally. And very often what would happen is that has been outsourced. Now, the problem is there's a paradigm problem with the whole issue of disability inclusion, because it's not exactly common. It's a new expectation. It's a relatively new thing in the world, literally only a handful of decades old, the idea of trying to include people with disabilities in the workplace, in education, etc. Now, so even professionals like OTs, nurses, psychologists don't necessarily have the expertise to adequately cater and adequately deal with issues surrounding disability, simply because they were never taught in that. If you were taught in the 70s, 80s, the word disability hardly came up. And the word reasonable accommodation hadn't been invented yet. So your professional service providers internally didn't always know what to do. It wasn't like they didn't have compassion or empathy, but they weren't necessarily expert. Then came along the idea of outsourced EAP. And the idea is a terrific idea at one level. You can see why companies would be quite interested in doing the thing. The problem is that you can't necessarily guarantee the respondent professional will be in any way expert or in any way experienced in dealing with, and I'm deliberately mincing my words here, not to be too hard, but this is one of the things that I've noticed with a huge amount of concern, is how often the outsourced EAP service lets the person with a disability down, simply because they are not adequately comfortable with the variety of issues related to the person with that kind of disability in the workplace. And I'm not suggesting that for a moment that individual's incompetent or not able to work. Quite the opposite. The sad part is that the professionals very often haven't the training. It doesn't make them bad. Ignorance is not something, isn't a sin. But if they haven't had the training and they attempt to do this thing and it's done badly, or inefficiently or inadequately, it very often ends in tears. And this is the bit that concerns me deeply. And I was discussing this on another webinar recently. And we were looking at solutions around what might be useful to because I've, in my short, literally in this year, it's only 3 months old, I've seen 3 boardings, 3 medical boardings of blind people or visually impaired people. And they're all professionals. They were all tertiary educated. They were all experienced.
Wow.
And 3 boarding. Now that is criminal in my view. And so all because of inexpert service provision by outsourced EAP professionals. Now, one of the solutions, I was talking to a PhD disability studies friend of mine, was perhaps what these service providers require is some sort of mentorship with experienced people like myself, who can guide them, because it's all about advice. It's all about advice. And if you don't have the knowledge or the experience, you don't know what to advise. And so you sometimes ask the wrong people and you get spurious advice. And then the company spends a lot of money on dodgy stuff, which doesn't work or is inappropriate. Then the staff member feels more and more guilty because they're asking for stuff because it's still not working, and it ends in tears. And it's all about asking the appropriate advice. So that's something that I've been mulling about, how on earth we can help organizations, because, and that's, I watched impotently as these 3 people got boarded. I'm an outsider. I have no power to climb in and try and prevent. I try, throw my weight around, and just laugh at me because I'm just a little guy, So it's a real problem. It's a real problem.
And I guess what happens in the larger organizational context then is that it makes disclosure even harder for other people that might be thinking about disclosing, because they see how it plays out and how it ends in tears.
And it makes disability equity harder because the management are gun shy now, and they say, I don't want one of those again.
Yes.
So there's that element as well. I mean, I remember a guy once saying to me, you guys are expensive, meaning people with visual impairments. And I said, why? And he said, the software costs are unbelievable. I said, well, hang on, man, you're a multinational company. It's a relative thing. I was talking about, this is about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. And he said, and I said, what are you looking at? And he said, I've just spent 70,000 Rand on the software. I said, that software costs 11,000 Rand if you get it from the right people. What had happened was he used his IT provider, who simply add the noughts on.
Yes. And then,
so,
of course,
he's now gun shy, never going to hire a blind guy again, until I told him that, of course.
Yeah. And if you put that into context, it might also just be, the equivalent of 2 business class flights to Europe and back, or something like that.
Exactly.
Which gets paid for quite easily and quite quickly by a lot of the larger corporations.
And yet it shouldn't have cost 2 business class flights. It should have cost half of an economy flight. So, so it's all about awareness and confidence at the end of the day.
So Jeremy, if we are an organization that wants to build disability confidence, and in particular if we want to support our staff members to disclose in ways that are also healthy and not harmful even earlier in the recruitment process, what are some of the things that we can do to promote disclosure in our organizations in a safe, inclusive way?
So you must put in some sort of an awareness strategy. You really need to increase your awareness, and starting from the top at an executive, management, staff level, and HR separately. So awareness is a key to that. But having said that, at the same time, one of the things that I've been doing for a long time is to try and demystify and de-scarify the issue of breaking down the definition. So the problem that many people have with disclosure is, what exactly is a disability? Now, the Code and the Employment Equity Act, particularly the Code, have a very, very, very clear definition. Now, it's a complex definition, and it is problematic in some ways because it's quite medical model oriented. But what needs to happen is that we need to, and if you read the sentence, it's a long sentence. You have a disability if you have a long-term or reoccurring physical or mental impairment that is substantially limiting in their entry into or advancement in the workplace. Now, most people have glazed over before I've finished half the sentence because none of it really makes much sense. I hope you didn't glaze over.
A little bit.
You see. So yes. When I teach this stuff, I unpack it and I say it 6 or 7 times with different inflections. And I unpack it, you see. And so what I've done is I've created a written version to unpack. So I write it out in full, but then I unpack it clause by clause, which is exactly what the code does, by the way. They do exactly the same thing. But I use a little bit of humor and I use a little less legalese, and then I turn it into a Q&A. And so the question, how, what does long term mean? And then I answer the question, and I do it in a softer, gentler way than the code would. I mean, the code will do the work, but I do it in such a way that it's a little less scary because of the Q&A way. And what I've found is over the years is that it has generated some success. You're never going to, I mean, you can't expect suddenly people come pouring in. But I've certainly seen success every time I've used it, where people have been a little more comfortable. So one of the things we've done is, and I've done this as well a lot, is creating a pack. I call it an awareness pack, graphic awareness pack. You've seen the one cartoon. I have many cartoons, but I use a pack of 12, and they in a sense they're almost like a graphic version of a booklet on basic awareness of dealing with persons with disabilities. And because they're graphic and they're cartoony and they're a little ironic and they're quite humorous, people pay attention to them. And there's a little blurb next door which says in very brief terms, don't ignore persons with disabilities when they walk in the room, or when somebody is asking for help, don't tell them it's over there, take them by the, or ask them if you can help them find that place, whatever. So there's 12 of them essentially. And what I do with that is you embed a hyperlink into that, so that when those are sent out to people's emails on their desktops, they read the cartoon. At the end, it says there, this company is committed to disability disclosure. If anybody has wants further information on disclosure and the definition of disabilities, click here. Click the hyperlink, and it takes them to that letter that I've written, which is breaks down the definition neatly with a little Q&A. And there's also an access point there to your EA1 form. Which is the form that you're required to fill in that stuff. Do I have a disability? And so now you have a little more knowledge because you've gone through the Q&A and you realize, you know what, actually I do. According to the definition, I do. And so now that do you see how it works? So that's what I've been using over the years. So, and I've been very cynical of disclosure campaigns because some of them are appalling and they haven't been done nicely or properly. They've just thrown the definition out there and hope somebody would work it out. And they very rarely work satisfactorily. So I've just tried to ameliorate the complexity of the definition.
Beautiful. That sounds like a really practical starting point. And what I hear you saying is we don't just start with the disability disclosure campaign, but also with the awareness piece embedded in it. Yeah. Otherwise, we might be disclosing into a system that actually does not receive that information in a safe and inclusive way.
That's right. But it doesn't mean that absolutely every single person in the organization has to have gone through some sort of workshop, because by then there's something of a, it's supported because some people will have gone through. And so it's not alien,
Yeah. I mean, have you seen any shifts just in the last while? I mean, a lot of people have disclosed mental and psychological strain over the last 2 years with COVID, even very senior people in some organizations. Do you think that kind of disclosure supports disability disclosure in general?
So it's an interesting one, because on the one hand, it's a success story, because so many people have, and we've been seeing it now for about 10 years, the increase in depression, bipolar, and anxiety related disabilities. And it's and on the one hand, a success. On the other hand, it's become problematic, because there's been very often not very expert diagnoses of, let's say, bipolar. And there's been an imperfect definition of depression. Many people think that when your rugby team loses, that's depression. That's not depression. The code's very clear. It says that if you have depression and it's disclosed as a disability, it needs to be clinical depression, which is diagnosed by a psychiatrist.
Yes.
That's a very different depression from when your rugby team loses. And
or
so
when your GP gives you antidepressants.
Absolutely. And so there's quite a lot of noise out there around the various psychosocial related disabilities on the increase, which has muddied the water quite a lot. And yet I can't be critical of it, because they have legitimate disabilities, many of them, and they deserve to be paid attention to. And so that's where EAP can be useful, because the free access and the easy access to counseling can be extremely useful there and well employed, if it's utilized, of course. That's far better than monkeying around with reasonable accommodation with more standard basic physical disabilities and sensory disabilities. So there EAP can really pay for itself, actually, and I think probably does in many ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting point. So what I'm hearing you say is that openly speaking about some of the psychosocial challenges, like, let's say, just more everyday challenges with depression and anxiety rather than clinical depression and anxiety, is a potentially positive place to encourage disclosure, and that it can also almost obscure some of the other real disabilities that, well, these are also real challenges, but real long-term disabilities that people sit with. And if all the conversation is just around anxiety and depression, some other people's needs become even more invisible because of the airtime taken up by that.
It's true. I suppose in some ways, by the way, that also works in reverse, because people with psychosocial disabilities, the old, what we used to call mental disabilities, they used to complain bitterly because all the tension was on the, as they put it, the sort of easier to grasp disabilities, your sensory and your physical disabilities, which you can kind of get your arms around. And it's true, hey? There's no question that less attention has been paid to the mentally linked disabilities than has to the physically sensory disabilities. So it works both ways. But the problem is when you get spurious disclosure, you got people disclosing. I mean, there was a joke we used to talk about. I used to talk about everybody with a hangover and a hangnail wants to disclose their disability now, or thinks they have a disability, and it's a problem, because it does distract from people with, as you said, I know you can't really use the term easily, but real disabilities, physical sensory disabilities. So this is not an easy game. It is a complex issue here, because the fact is that unfortunately many employers don't actually want the complexity and the drama related to particularly some of the more mainstream disabilities. They don't want to have to worry about the access in the environment for the guys with the physical disabilities. They don't want to spend the money on software for the visual guys. They absolutely don't want to spend money on the sign language interpreter, possibly, or some other facility for a deaf person or hearing impaired person. And so they would rather have something that they believe would be actually, so a well-controlled person with bipolar is actually more popular, because they think they can get away with it. So the whole thing is flawed, really, that we have to have a mechanical legislation to try and force us into getting more persons with disabilities. That's not actually a good, that's a negative correction.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. So I want to thank you for your time, and I want to use this as an opportunity to remind all of us that what we are doing is we're finding ways for humans to connect with other humans through all the many versions of challenges that we bring into these relationships, whether we are people with disabilities, whether we are people with hangnails or hangovers, or whether we just complex people at the end of COVID that have run out of patience. We are humans working with humans, and in the long run, what we want to create is inclusive workplaces where everyone can feel that they can show up to be themselves. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time. Any last thoughts as we end off this podcast?
No, I couldn't have said it better myself. I love the way you said it. You know, let's push for inclusion. That's really the bottom line. What we're after is people with disabilities to be included as absolutely everybody else is, and don't have to, you know, be catered for separately or be ignored. And so it's all about inclusion. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And if you're interested to speak to us more, you can always contact us at aephoria.co.za, and Jeremy is available at disabilitydesk.co.za.
That's right. Jeremy at disabilitydesk.co.za will find me.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Lucille. Lovely to see you again.
Bye.